There is increasing evidence that training at the right effort level is important to develop speed and endurance, and that the majority of your training should be at lower training zones. So the question is, how do you know where your training zones are? There are multiple ways to calculate your training zones, but one of the easiest ways is to use the talk method. And how this works is if you can easily hold a conversation while you're running, cycling, whatever your activity is, then you're in the lower intensity zones, zones 1 and 2. Anything that requires you to start increasing your rate of breathing or to breathe harder is going to be either moderate or high intensity. But we're going to get into that in more detail, as well as some other methods to calculate your training zones coming up. Spartans, welcome back. And today we're going to be talking about training zones. But first, before we get into how to calculate or figure out what your training zones are, we really should go over what are the different training zones and what do they mean. So starting at number 1, this is going to be the lowest intensity training zone that you can attain and still get your heart rate up. So these are going to be recovery runs, recovery rides. They don't take a lot of effort. I mean, you could do, this sort of a pace for days if you had to, if you were trained. Like this is the easiest level to get the heart rate up, but allows you to, you'll recover. You're not working hard. Zone 2 is going to be where you're probably going to spend the majority of your time in training. It's a little bit harder than zone 1, but it's still an easy pace. We talked about it in the intro that you can hold a conversation while you're doing this activity. If you can't easily hold a conversation, then you're starting to get in the moderate high intensities. But this pace is probably what most of us would do for a marathon or longer, a long trail run. It's a pace that you could sustain for hours. And that 80%, if you've read 80-20 by Matt Fitzgerald, this is where the bulk of that 80% is spent in zone 2 to build your aerobic base. Zone 3 is moderate intensity. So this is probably anything for most people longer than a 10K up to maybe a marathon. You could maybe do it for an hour, maybe 2, just depending on how fit you are. But it starts to push you, and this is where you're not going to be recovering while you're doing your training. This is a little bit higher level, but you don't get the benefits of, say, zones 4 and zones 5 to really increase your speed. And so you really don't want to spend too much time here unless you're training for a longer event like a marathon, or as you're getting closer to race day for whatever distance that you're doing, you may throw some of this in there. But really want to kind of minimize zone 3. Zone 4 is where you're really starting to push your pace. You're going to be breathing harder. You might only be able to speak in a couple word sentences. And this is probably, again, for most of us, like a 5K, 10K pace. It's something you could sustain for maybe 30 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. But you're really going to be getting your heart rate up and you're really going to be pushing yourself. This is an uncomfortable zone to get into once you start hitting zone 4. And then zone 5 is obviously the maximum intensity zone. This is, an effort you could sustain maybe a minute to 3 minutes max. You're sprinting, really charging up a hill. You really get a lot of benefit if you want to increase your speed, your foot turnover. Again, kind of building your aerobic base as well. There are a lot of benefits to zone 4 and zone 5 training, but you can't spend a lot of time there or you're going to put yourself at risk for injury, for burnout, overtraining syndrome, a lot of those things. So you got to be, cautious about how you use that. Maybe get a couple runs in a week at those kind of intensity zones 4 and 5. So, how do you figure out where your zones are? And there are a couple of different ways. The first 2 that we're going to talk about 5 altogether, but the first 2 don't really require any sort of special equipment. You don't need a heart rate monitor, a power meter. You don't really have to do a lot of calculations. The first one we talked about is the talk test. If you can easily hold a conversation, maybe you have to catch your breath after a few sentences, then you're in zone 2 or lower. And so what you can do is you can count, from 1 to 20 while you're running a pace. And if you can't easily do that, then you're probably hitting the moderate intensity zone you need to back down. So you can start slow, slowly ramp up until it starts to get uncomfortable and you're having to breathe harder and catch your breath. And that's a really simple way to do it. I would say what I do the majority of the time, because it works really good for trail running, if you're doing a really long effort, doing a lot of miles, and that is going off of what they call relative perceived effort, or RPE. And it's basically, you figure out in your mind, how hard am I pushing myself right now? Is this easy? Is this something that I could do forever? Kind of like a warm-up run, an easy jog, or maybe for some of you might be, pushing a brisk walk. And something that starts to get your heart rate up, but in your mind, There are a couple of different scales. So Matt Fitzgerald wrote 80-20 running, 80-20 triathlon. Great book. I'd highly recommend reading it if you haven't yet. I'll put a link to the book down in the description. But the way that he breaks down the intensity zones in terms of relative perceived effort are a scale of 1 to 10. Now there's something called the Borg method. It's more scientific. It's a scale of 6 to 20, 6 being like no effort whatsoever, 20 being, the absolute maximum you could possibly do in a full out sprint for maybe 20 seconds, right? And there's everything in between, but going from a 6 to a 20 is kind of weird to conceptualize in your mind. At least it would be for me. So a lot of people don't use that. They do it for tests because it's a little bit more scientific. But 1 to 10 is a really easy scale. So zone 1 would be an effort level, on that scale would be a 1 to 2. Zone 2 would be 3 to 4. Zone 3 would be 5, 6. Zone 4 would be 7, 8. And then 9 and 10 would be zone 5. So that's how Matt does it. Now, if you've ever heard of Jason Koop, he's another running coach. He runs CTS Running. I've actually used them in the past to help me train for my I'm Tough 100. I'll put a link up here if you want to watch that video. Crazy hard race, awesome experience. But anyways, they helped me prepare for that. But the way that Jason Koop likes to break this down, he does a little bit different. So an effort level 4 to 5 would be zone 1 on his scale. And this is one that I personally like to use. 5 to 6 is getting into zone 2. 7 is that intermediate zone. 8, 9 would be zone 4, and then 10 would be zone 5, all out effort, maybe a couple minutes maximum ability to keep that type of pace going. So that's what I use. It works easier for me. Like a 1 and a 2 just seems so low. It's all preference, but those are 2 scales that you can use. Or if you want to try the Borg scale, starting from 6 to 20, however you want to do it. They require no equipment, but you really have to be in tune with your body because you're basing your pace, your effort, everything on how you feel. And the nice thing about this is if you're doing a lot of climbing, a lot of mountain, really technical terrain, it can be hard to go off of pace. Heart rate can get skewed, especially if you're doing really long runs. It's really hot. If you do caffeine, there are a lot of things that can start to affect your heart rate. And so the effort, how your body feels, like ultimately when you're in a race, like you have to go off your body feels, because after 5, 6, 7 hours, like you can't say, I need to hit this pace. Like you can only do what your body says that you can do at that point. And so you really got to be able to listen to your body. So I really like relative perceived effort, and I kind of use a combination of the other things that we're going to talk about, but ultimately how I feel is what I go off of. That's the second method that you can use, relative perceived effort. The third method is going off of heart rate, and this is probably one of the more popular ways to do it. This is my other go-to that I use in addition to perceived effort, and there are a couple of different ways that you can calculate your heart rate zones. I would say if you're going to use heart rate, do not use the heart rate monitor on your watch. I've tried it before. It is notoriously bad about picking up your cadence or your pace instead of your heart rate. And so if you're gonna do it, the best way that I found is with a chest strap, a heart rate strap that goes around your chest. They do have ones that go around like your upper arm. I've never used those, I can't say, but to me, I've gotten the best results on a chest strap far and away. So, but if you're gonna do heart rate, you have to be able to calculate your heart rate zones. There are a couple ways to do this. One would be to do relative perceived effort, figure out what your zones are, run maybe 5 minutes in each zone, up until zone 5, obviously, because you can't sustain a zone 5 pace for that long. But you hit zone 1, kind of get in there, and you look at what your average heart rate is. You could do like if you've got a watch that keeps track of this, you could hit, a lap at the beginning, a lap at the end, kind of slowly ramp through zone 1. Then once you hit to zone 2, you can hit your lap again and slowly work your way through zone 2 for 5 minutes and see what that heart rate zone is. Same thing for 3, 4, and then 5 is just going to be, you could sprint for like 2 minutes and see what your average heart rate is at the end of the sprinting, or your maximum heart rate is. But where heart rate monitoring falls down is zones 4 and zone 5, because it takes a good 30, 40 seconds or longer for your heart rate to build up to where you're at in terms of your effort level. So by the time you get through a minute and a half in zone 5, you may be barely hitting that heart rate zone. And so it's going to give you some funky data. So it doesn't really work well for that, but it's great at keeping you in zones 1 and 2, because those are easier efforts. You're doing those for a longer amount of time, and it's kind of a good fail-safe to keep you from creeping into zone 3. And that's what I really use heart rate monitoring for. Once I get past zone 2, it's kind of a crapshoot. I just go off of relative perceived effort at that point. a more scientific way that you can calculate your heart rate zones, but this is the most uncomfortable by far, and I've done it and it really sucks. But what you do is you need to do a 30-minute maximal effort that you can sustain for 30 minutes. So you start warming up in zone 1 for about 5 minutes. You do a couple strides where you kind of slowly increase your stride length and your stride rate to sort of kind of work into zone, you're probably gonna be in zone 4 for this. And then once you hit that stride rate, you hit your lap button, and then that's when you start that 30-minute time. And then once you've gotten 20 minutes into your run, you're probably gonna be feeling like you're hurting a little bit. But that's when you hit the lap button again, because where you calculate your heart rate is the last 10 minutes of that 30-minute run. So you run 20 minutes, hit the lap, and then from that last 10 minutes, you're gonna hit the lap again at the end, and whatever your average heart rate is at the end of the last 10 minutes of the 30-minute run is your lactate threshold heart rate. Meaning like that's the pace that you can do where you start to build up lactic acid. So anyways, it'll give you the lactate threshold heart rate, and then there are ways to calculate the different zones, from your lactate threshold heart rate. Zone 1 is going to be 75 to 80% of your lactate threshold heart rate. Zone 2 is going to be 81 to 89%. Zone 3 is going to be 96 to 100%. And now why is there that little gap there? It's because you don't want to accidentally creep from zone 2 into zone 3. There needs to be a gap so that you've got a little bit of distance between what your max zone 2 is and the lower level of zone 3. So that way you're clearly delineating, is this more of an endurance pace or is this more of a mid-range pace, a moderate effort level? Zone 4 is going to be 102 to 105% of your lactate threshold heart rate, and then 106% of your lactate threshold heart rate plus is going to be zone 5. There is also, I'm going to put a link down in the description. Matt Fitzgerald has a website where for free you can put in your lactate threshold heart rate and it will calculate all of your heart rate zones for you. And again, the link is going to be down in the description if you want to use that. So that's the third way is using heart rate to train. But again, there are pitfalls with that. It's not perfect. The fourth way that you can calculate your zones are by using your pace. So again, every single one of these has flaws, right? None of these is perfect. You kind of use them in combination. If you are on a same flat surface at the same kind of temperature, feeling the same way that day in terms of how good you feel, and like there's no wind, then pace can be perfect. So what you do is you can calculate what your heart rate zones are and then figure out what your pace range is for that heart rate zone, getting the lower end of zone 1 to the upper end of zone 1, and figure out what your pace is for that. Same for zone 2, 3, 4, 5, so on. The problem is as you get more fit after a month or 2 or 3, your pace is going to get faster because you're building your aerobic engine, you're increasing mitochondria. We talked about this in this other video about how 80-20 training works, but you're gonna get more fit. As you get more fit, your pace is gonna get faster for the same effort level. And so every couple of months, you have to recalculate what your pace is. Otherwise, you're gonna start dropping into lower zones at the same pace. So, that's one of the pitfalls. The other pitfall is if you start to get on any sort of hilly terrain, technical terrain, if it's not flat, pace goes out the window because you can't sustain the same pace on a flat track as when you're trying to run up, a 3,000-foot mountain climb over a couple of miles. There's just absolutely no way you can do that. So pace only works for flat surfaces, but you've got to recalculate it every couple of months because it's going to change. So pace is probably the one I use the least because I run a lot of trails. But if you're preparing for like a 5K, 10K, flat road marathon, half marathon, pace can be great. So the last method that you can use, number 5, to calculate your training zones, I don't know that I would use this. I think the data is still out there on whether or not this works, especially for trail runners, but it's using a power meter. Now in cycling, power meters are huge, right? Like that is the number one method you use to gauge where your training zones are, how much you've progressed. Like it is huge, but it's had a lot of time in that sport to make excellent power meters that are very accurate, give you reliable data, and they know how to interpret that information. Running, it hasn't gotten there yet. It's just within the last couple of years, the power meters have really come out for running. I would say if you're going to get a running power meter, and I do not own one, and I do not have any stock in this company, is StridePod. And I only say this because I've looked at, Jason Coops posted articles on this, and I've looked at actually research articles on the best power meters are out there for running, and StridePod is like far and away the number one that everybody mentions in research articles, as well as elite athletic coaches in endurance sports. So if you're gonna get a power meter, I would go with Stride personally. Again, it's just because that's the one that's been shown to be most reliable. But it's only been shown to be reliable on flatter surfaces. If you hit the trails, the data is just not quite there. It's using your foot strike and velocity and different things, and walking. Walking, it's also not super accurate, and there have been studies that have shown this. And I can post a couple of links to what I was looking at, kind of doing some background research. So if you're walking a lot, if you're doing climbs, it's just not really accurate. And honestly, I don't know that we know how to use that power meter data for running yet. Now, over the next couple of years, it's going to evolve. I'm sure it's going to become a key component of training, just like it is in cycling, and I'm sure it's going to become better at trail running, and mountain running, anything that's not flat. But I just don't know that it's quite there yet, so I can't recommend it. But if you do decide to do it, I'd go with StridePod. It's going to cost you about $200 or a little bit less if you get the Stride subscription. But again, I can't speak one way or the other. I just know what I've read from other people using it. So the way that I do it is I go off of relative perceived effort is the king. But if I'm on flat, I'll kind of look at my pace. If I'm doing anything else, I'll mostly use my heart rate. But keeping in mind that the longer I run, the hotter it gets. If I haven't been feeling real great, heart rate's not going to be the most accurate. And so how I feel is the best. And I run alone, so I really don't have opportunity to talk to people. And it looks like you're crazy if you sit there talking to yourself all the time to see if you can do that breathing test and make sure you're in zone 2. So those are the training zones. I'm going to do another video that's going to go into depth about how to use these zones as part of your training, depending on what kind of racing that you're doing and how to structure your training, but that's for another day. So until then, get out there, train hard, train smart, and train Spartan. We'll see you next time.